Hey guys. In case you missed it, I wanted to go over the material that you missed in yesterday's lesson. Or if you just want to go back through it and listen to it again because I went too fast, you can use this as well. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start our first unit of the year, which is the Introduction to Psychology. We'll talk about the history of psychology, some approaches, some research methods, and as well as some ethical studies and things like that too. This unit is a double unit, which means it's a little bit longer. So our assessment, if you don't remember, will be on October 2nd. We will have some activities, we will have some time to review things, but if you haven't started reading the book, I highly recommend that you do so soon. Okay? We're going to start really figuring out why we do what we do. And to do that, we really have to start by understanding the history of how we got to the current definition that we have. So, we're going to look at how it's developed from a philosophical speculation into a modern research based science. So, the first thing we need to answer is what is psychology? Well, we're going to break down the word itself. The part of the word psyche means mind or soul. Logos is the study of. So if you've heard of like biology, biologos, zoology, zoologos, cardiology, cardiologos, logos is the study of. So when we talk about psychology, we're talking about the study of the mind or soul. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. Um, Psychology really develops in the late 1800s, but we are interested in how our minds work and why we do what we do long before then. So these four people, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes, are all in your book, and I'm not going to spend time going over the four of them. There are also two other people who aren't pictured here: Sir Francis Bacon, who talks about empiricism, and John Locke, who talks about the tabula rasa. Uh, do yourself a favor. I think it's like 2 pages on these guys. Please make sure you read about them. I will tell you that I've seen at least one question about these guys in general on every AP exam for the past few years, including when I took it in high school. So please make sure that you read about them and you know who they are. They're very important. But we, for our purposes, are going to skip ahead to the fun stuff, the actual birth of psychology. So, since we're talking about the birth of psychology, we should probably recognize its parents. Psychology is in this like weird space between philosophy and physiology, in that we're talking about our minds and our sense of self, which comes from philosophy, but we're also talking about how our brains and our bodies function, which is the physiology aspect. So, psychology comes from these two fields, asking questions like how are bodily sensations turned into a mental awareness of the outside world? So, that's like if you feel, let's say, a spider crawling on your arm. Sorry if that image freaks you out. How does that feeling translate to you to you understanding something's on your arm and you need to swat it off? Okay. We also have our perceptions of the world accurate reflections of reality. Can we trust what we're seeing and hearing and understanding about the world? You'll learn later, no, we can't. And of course, most importantly, how do the mind and body interact? Most people looking at these questions are thinking about them from their own fields of research. So, a philosopher will think about how do the mind and body interact in terms of our senses of self and in terms of, our brain controlling us. Whereas a physiologist might look at it from a different point of view. So, we really need one person to bring both of these sides together. And that one man is Wilhelm Wundt. It's this guy over here. Wilhelm Wundt is a philosopher and a physiologist, and he starts to push for psychology to really be its own thing. So, in the late 1800s, we're focusing on the initial definition of psychology, the study of the mind. So, we're looking at your feelings, your thoughts, your dreams, that kind of stuff. Um, so, in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt is a professor and a researcher at University of Leipzig in Germany. And he comes up with this experiment to test the difference between being aware of something and being aware of your awareness. And the way he does this is he has people sit and listen to a tone being played. And that's the picture under the word consciousness. So when he plays that tone, he has you respond when you first hear the tone. And then he has you do it again later when you are aware that you've heard the tone. Which he noticed there's a lag behind that second part. So it takes you a little bit longer to process that second part, whereas the first part's, pretty immediate. This experiment in his lab really makes it to the point where this is the first formal lab for psych research. And 2 years later, he establishes a journal that publishes information about psych research. And these two together really earn him the title of the father of psychology. So I'm going to ask you this many times throughout the year, who is the father of psychology? It is always Wilhelm Wundt in every single scenario. Okay? His idea about psychology was very straightforward and basic. So he defined it as the scientific study of conscious experience. So, the study of the mind. He also talks about consciousness a lot, which is your awareness of your immediate experience. So, what's going on around you, which he says takes place in your mind. And his view really dominates psychology, primarily because he's teaching a bunch of students who go off and continue their own research, but like with his as a foundation. So he really is the one who paves the way and like sets all the trails for us as we move forward. So he has two branches from him, and we call these branches schools of thought. It's really important to know that there are a lot of schools of thought that we're going to talk about, but we're going to start with the two like most foundational ones. So this is in the late 1800s still, and Edward Titchener we're going to start with. He was a former student of Wundt's, and he goes to Cornell to teach. Um, he also founds what's called structuralism, which is our first school of thought that we'll talk about. Structuralism is based on the idea that our job as psychologists is to analyze consciousness into basic elements and then investigate them. So he's looking at it like a physicist would, for example. We're looking at the basic particles to understand the big picture. And when he talks about the fundamental components or the basic elements or structures of conscious experience, he's talking about things like your sensations, your feelings, your images, anything in that specific moment. Okay. A lot of the work here involves sensation and perception in the beginning. So your response to different things you're seeing, you're smelling, and you're hearing. And it also relies very heavily on introspection. That word should be underlined because it is a key word. And that's self observation of your own conscious experience. So, not anyone can do this, but what they kind of do is they train you to talk about how you're feeling in a more objective and self aware kind of way. And that way you can analyze what you're feeling to talk about why you're maybe feeling it and things like that. It's definitely not perfect because people are unreliable at best and completely clueless about why they feel things at worst. So it's really just a jump start moment that we kind of move away from later on. But in the beginning, it's really helpful. On the other hand, we have Mr. William James. And he views our job as psychologists a little bit differently. So he splinters off and founds functionalism. Functionalism is based on the belief that we should be focusing on the function or purpose of consciousness instead of the structures. So he's looking at why we have a consciousness at all. Because he says focusing on the structures make us miss the real nature of conscious experience, which is more like a flowy river instead of like the rocks along it. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but if you think of consciousness as this like stream, this ever flowing, ever changing, continuous body of water that's forever moving. He says structuralism is looking at like the little rocks along the way or the logs along the way, whereas functionalism looks at the entire stream itself. And this is where the idea of stream of consciousness actually comes from. That idea that our consciousness is continuously moving and continuously changing, and it's not just a moment in time. So the other things they look for in functionalism are your memories and your emotions, things that persist over a long period of time. They also focus on how we adapt to our environments and the demands of the real world in functionalism. And they say that's because our consciousness has allowed us to do that. Our consciousness is adaptive, meaning it's helped us survive, which is why we have it. Functionalism is very heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and his views on evolution, which you'll read about more and we'll talk about in a little bit when we get to the evolutionary approach. But these are really the two dominating theories right now. So, from the 1920s to the 1960s, we start to change our definition of psychology just a bit because it's no longer just the scientific study of the mind, which has been really helpful so far. Um, but we now know that it should be something else because, like I said, introspection is really unreliable and it's really hard to prove a lot of the stuff that the functionalists and structuralists are talking about. So we decide to start moving to focus on your behavior, what you're doing. Every time you touch your nose, cut class, smile when your phone rings, these are things that we can observe. So around 1920, um, we start moving away from the idea of introspection and focusing much less on the conscious experience. So, the first guy we're going to talk about is Sigmund Freud. You've probably heard about him before. He is one of my favorite psychologists. Um, and he is in Vienna and treating rich women with anxiety. And as he's talking to these women, he's noticing things like a Freudian slip. So when you say one thing, but you meant to say something else, that tends to reveal how you really feel about something when you do that. So if I were to tell my friend, I have to go teach the psychology course, then I probably don't want to actually teach the class. And he said, that's interesting that people will do that. And I wonder why. He also notices that people's dreams seem to bring up feelings that you aren't immediately aware of yourself. So if you dream of throwing your sister into a volcano and sacrificing her to the 2020 gods, chances are you probably don't like your sister very much, even if you're not saying that out loud. So Freud's taking all these different things and he's observing all these different things, and it leads him to believe in the existence of the unconscious, which contains thoughts, memories, and desires that are below our level of awareness. He believes that our unconscious is this invisible hand that guides our behavior. And his goal in his school of thought, psychoanalysis, is to get people to be aware of those unconscious desires and drives that guide our behavior. This is a huge departure from introspection because he's telling people that no, you're really not fully aware of everything that affects your behavior, and we're actually not even masters of our own mind. A lot of people are really unhappy with this, and we will talk about him more later in the year in pretty much every single unit. But this is the beginning of a very negative view of psychology. Around the same time, there's another group that's saying goodbye to introspection. John Watson founds the school of behaviorism, which believes that psychology should only study observable behaviors. He wanted to abandon the idea of studying consciousness altogether because he says science has to be verifiable. We have to be able to prove what we're saying. It's really hard to verify the validity of a thought because it's private. Anyone can lie about what they're thinking. But behaviors, any observable response or activity, can be very easily verified. So if you're going to look at the number of times that I look at the clock throughout the day, chances are you guys are all going to get the same number of times I look at the clock. If you're going to try and guess what I am thinking, chances are you're going to come up with dozens upon dozens of different answers because you have no way of knowing and you're just making a guess. And even if you do guess, I could still lie to you, and that's not reliable. So that's part of Watson's big belief. And B.F. Skinner comes along and furthers this idea along with him. And he doesn't deny the existence of internal mental events, so like your thoughts and things like that. But he says that we can't study them scientifically, and we really don't have to. His belief is very straightforward. We tend to repeat behaviors that lead to positive outcomes, and not repeat behaviors that lead to negative or neutral outcomes. So if it rewards us, we'll do it again. If it punishes us or even just doesn't reward us, we probably won't do it again. And he does a lot of this testing on animals. So he's the one who convinces rats to push levers. He's the one who teaches pigeons how to play ping pong using their beaks. So he's proving that this stuff works. You can get someone to do pretty much anything just by rewarding or punishing them. The problem that a lot of people have with behaviorism, though, is that this view suggests that all of our behavior is governed by external stimuli, which is your environment. And that means your behavior is fairly predictable. So we have no conscious control over our actions, and we're controlled by our environment. As you can imagine, this is the other big negative view of psychology. And once we get to the next part of this, which this is where we left off in all the classes, we're going to talk about, what happens next in terms of some more positive views that need to come to light. Thanks for listening.